Thomas Blackjack Ketchum was the only person ever hanged in Clayton, New Mexico. He was also the only man ever hanged for train robbery in the entire state, a law that was later found to be unconstitutional. But it was a little too late for poor Blackjack. Remembering his experience long ago, a gentleman tells a story of meeting Blackjack Ketchum while camping at the Philmont Scout Ranch. He and several other scouts were backpacking through the mountains, visiting various historic sites, including an abandoned gold mine, a ghost town, and one of Blackjack Ketchum's outlaw hideouts. The hideout was a large rock overhang, and the scouts thought it would be fun to camp there for the night. However, their leader insisted that they stay at a nearby designated site. Disappointed, several of the scouts set their tents up several hundred feet away from the leader's tent, hoping they would have a chance to sneak back to the hideout later that night. About 11 p.m., when the rest of the camp was fast asleep, 5 scouts gathered their sleeping bags and quietly stole back to the hideout. They set up camp under the overhang and built a fire where they sat around talking about their trip. When the fire burned down to nothing more than red coals, the scouts settled down in their sleeping bags. The storyteller drifted off to sleep thinking about Blackjack. Suddenly, he was awakened by a noise in the bushes. He said he felt paralyzed, unable to move, and tried to call out to the others, but his throat was all knotted up. Then he saw a cowboy, dressed all in black, come running out of the bushes toward the hideout. He said the man was mostly solid, but some parts of him appeared translucent. He described the man as filthy, wearing a tattered hat and clothes from the 1800s, with yellow teeth. His face was very red, glistening with sweat, and he had a thick beard. The apparition held a revolver. The cowboy was unaware of the scout, but the boy was terrified, as much by his inability to move as by the man. As he watched, a strange fog emanated from the tree line across from a small stream, and he could hear men yelling unintelligibly, followed by muffled gunfire. The cowboy turned and fired his revolver 6 times into the trees and then ran and stood right over the scout. The cowboy was wounded in the shoulder and discharged 6 shell casings from his revolver right on top of the boy. As he watched, the casings disappeared as they fell onto his sleeping bag. The cowboy then reloaded his revolver and fired additional shots into the trees. Suddenly, the cowboy saw the scout. The expression on the cowboy's face indicated that the scout had just suddenly appeared before his eyes. The cowboy seemed to be confused and confounded, while the scout was terrified. Then, the cowboy uncocked his pistol, looking at the scout very closely, and said, "You're not supposed to be here," and then just disappeared into thin air. Eventually, he could go back to sleep, but which had to be repeatedly shaken by his fellow campers before waking in the morning. As the scouts broke camp, the boy told his fellow camper about the dream, and the story amused them. But as the scout rolled up his sleeping bag, he found 6 shell casings in the dust. Later, when they returned to base camp, the scout visited an old saloon where a photograph of Blackjack Ketchum, the same man that the scout had seen at the hideout, was displayed. When he told his friends, they dismissed him, setting them up for a big hoax. The scout never told anyone about it again, but he kept the shell casings. After the scout returned home, he consulted with a gun expert who stated that the casings were dated to sometime around 1878, but were in almost brand new condition and gunpowder residue could still be detected in them. In fact, gunpowder was used in the last century, but not today. The scout kept the casings for years, but unfortunately, after he moved away from home, his mother threw them out, along with several other items the boy had saved, such as comic books and baseball cards. Some hauntings resemble life in eerie ways, with ghosts engaging in activities similar to those of living people, such as walking around or working. Ghost experts describe these hauntings in several ways. The first is that the ghost is simply doing something that they frequently did in life. The second assumes that the sci-fi concept of the time-space continuum is real, and that sometimes two time frames overlap. The third explanation is a place memory, which is like recording a past event that has imprinted itself on the environment. Images and sounds are impressed upon a place and later replayed in a phenomenon similar to watching a loop of a movie film. So perhaps there is no ghost in these types of hauntings, but rather some psychic record of a person from long ago. I grew up at the Genesee Buffalo Ranch, just west of Denver, Colorado. My father is still the ranch's caretaker and lives in the 2-story house built by the Patrick family in the 1860s. Headed west from Missouri, the Patricks and their 5 boys built the house and operated a stage stop on Genesee Mountain. When we moved into the house, the former caretaker lived in a house trailer in the backyard. His wife would not set foot in the main house because she had seen strange things and claimed it was haunted. When I was about 12, I remember a night when my mother was upstairs screaming hysterically as our dog barked loudly at the wall. My dad and I ran upstairs to see what the commotion was all about. When we arrived, she related that she had seen a floating, glowing green ball go down the hall and disappear through the wall. I slept with the covers over my head for the next several weeks. The subsequent haunting came about 6 months later, a night that still feels as if it happened yesterday. As I was sleeping, my father woke me up and asked me if I could hear music in the house. Barely, I could make out the faint sounds of a fiddle or violin. Dad had already checked all the radios and they were not turned on. We searched for the music source and went downstairs, where we heard the music coming from the upper story and vice versa. When we went out Sedgwick Eats, we could still hear the music coming from the house. We continued to hear the haunting music a couple more times that same year. A few years later, we received a book from a local historian that described the complete history of the house and the Patrick family, information that was previously unknown to us until we read the book. The first murder in Jefferson County happened in our front yard in the 1870s when one of the Patrick brothers shot and killed another brother in a dispute over a dog. The brother he killed was known to be very lazy, and the only thing he liked to do was sit around and play his fiddle. When I read this and remembered the fiddle music during those nights, and a cold electric sweat ran through my body. We also found out that the boy's father is buried somewhere in the yard, but there is no marker. The house has been peaceful for several years now, and hopefully the Patricks are at peace. I still get a chill when I hear fiddle music. In 1848, Henry Wayne, a quartermaster major, suggested to the War Department the importation of camels for military purposes in the American Southwest. 2 years later, Secretary of War and Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis attempted to persuade the Senate to investigate the use of camels for the U.S. Army. During this time period, the Southwest territory of the United States was greatly expanding, and it was thought that camels could carry at least twice the amount of weight as horses or mules. They might also be used in tracking and pursuing Indians, as they could travel without water or rest for much longer than horses. It was also suggested that the camels might carry the mail, and that fast camel passenger trains might be developed to run from Missouri river points to the Pacific coast. Initially, the senators voted the idea down, but after California newspapers began promoting it, they finally agreed in 1854, passing a bill to appropriate $30,000 for the camel experiment. Some 72 camels arrived in the country in early 1857 and were put to work carrying supplies in the southwestern United States. Although the camels proved to be well suited for travel through the region, their unpleasant disposition, habit of frightening horses, and tendency to wander off at night made them very unpopular among the soldiers. Still, they continued to be used until the Civil War broke out, at which time they were sold at auction or abandoned in the desert. Wild camels continued to be spied roaming in the desert for years afterward, especially in Arizona. Along with these real sights, several legends and tales began regarding these ugly beasts of burden. The most popular is the tale of a camel known as the Red Ghost. In 1883, a woman was found trampled to death, and on her body in a nearby bush were clumps of reddish fur. Large hoof prints were found in the area, but locals were perplexed. A short time later, a large animal careened into a tent where 2 miners slept. Though they could not identify the beast, large hoof prints and red hair tufts were left behind again. After more incidents, the locals recognized the large animal as a camel. Soon, people began to report seeing the camel, which one rancher said carried a rider, although the rider appeared to be dead. The following report came from a group of prospectors who saw the camel and, while watching him, spied something falling from its back. As the beast moved on, the prospectors went to see what had fallen and discovered a human skull. For the next several years, numerous others spied the camel, which had been dubbed the Red Ghost, carrying its headless rider by this time. However, in 1893, when an Arizona farmer found the red camel grazing in his garden, he shot and killed the beast. By this time, the large camel had shaken free of its dead rider, but still bore the saddle and leather straps with which the corpse had been attached. There was much speculation as to who the mysterious dead rider the camel had carried for several years might have been. One tale alleges that the rider was a young soldier afraid of the camels and therefore had difficulty learning how to ride them. To teach him how his fellow soldiers tied him to the top of the beast, determined that he would get over his fear. They then hit the camel on the rump, and the beast ran. Though the soldiers pursued the camel and his rider, the red beast easily outpaced them and escaped into the desert. Neither the camel nor his helpless rider was ever seen again. Though the abandoned beasts of the Camel Corps roamed for decades, they soon disappeared altogether. In 1907, a prospector reported seeing 2 wild camels in Nevada and other reports continued to come in sporadically. However, in April 1934, the Oakland Tribune reported, "The last American camel is dead." The camel, dubbed Topsy, was last seen trekking across the desert of Arizona into California. When she made her way to Los Angeles, she was taken to Griffith Park to live. However, sometime later, she became so crippled with the paralysis that the zoo attendants were forced to put her down. Seemingly all the real army camels have long passed. However, legends continue to abound of people sighting a giant red camel carrying a headless rider in the deserts of Arizona. Red Ghost, maybe living up to his name. Yet another legend of a ghostly camel also persists. This camel belonged to a prospector named Jake, who had purchased 3 camels from the army at the public auction. Though his camels were every bit as ornery as the soldiers had described them, he spent much time caring for them and had nothing but praise for his beasts of burden. After Jake hit pay dirt, he led his gold-laden camels into town to sell his ore. Afterward, he headed to the local saloon to celebrate. Unfortunately, in the crowd was a man named Paul Adams, who listened intently to Jake's story of his gold find. Jake didn't go directly to his claim when he left to return to his mine, knowing that he might be followed. Though he was careful and took a circuitous route, a man named Paul Adams followed him. When Jake encamped for the night, Adams, thinking that he was at the mine's location, murdered him. Trying to protect his owner, one of the camels attacked Adams and for his efforts was shot by a scoundrel, but not before he had viciously bitten him. Adams then began to search in earnest for Jake's mine until one night, the ghost of Jake riding upon the dead camel approached his camp and chased the scoundrel into town, straight to the sheriff's office. Frightened beyond belief, Paul Adams then made a full confession. Whether Jake and his loyal camel continue to roam the desert is unknown.
Now remember, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Then subscribe for more horrifying true stories.